want to get a little bit more into the weeds when it comes to acetaminophen and autism, because I think it's worth deep diving a little bit to understand what the research currently shows and what it doesn't show. There's a huge study that has been cited in the report and in other reports that looks at children in Sweden. Over 2 million Swedish children were studied for 3 decades. And I'm going to switch my camera here so that you can see in just a second the study, and I'm going to walk through, not line by line, but all the big highlights that you should know when it comes to the study and what it showed when it looks at acetaminophen and autism. And it is a little bit nuanced. If you just look at a couple of the highlighted things, you'd say, okay, this supports that. But then when we actually read the conclusions and read how they did the science and everything like that, I think you'll see that their conclusion that autism and acetaminophen aren't linked, when we look at the child, the genetics, and the environment, that there isn't that conclusion. That will come to light. Now, I recorded this portion where I look at the PDF and go through it with you this morning while I was sitting outside on my front porch. And so you will hear crickets in the background, and you might hear a rooster or two crowing because we live outside of town and roosters crow basically all the time. All right, so in this study, we're just going to kind of walk through the paper because I think it's really helpful to see how it was set up and everything along those lines. So in this study, there were 2 million children that were born in Sweden between 1995 and 2019. So it was over a number of years. And what they looked at is acetaminophen use during pregnancy. Now, in contrast to a lot of studies done in the States, Sweden has a very broad national health registry. And instead of asking years later, do you remember taking Tylenol or acetaminophen during your pregnancy, they were actually collecting that information at the very first visit when they were doing their prenatal care. And then throughout the prenatal care, they were doing it and then entering that information in. It was tracked really well, so we knew who was exposed to acetaminophen and who wasn't with much higher certainty than asking people years later, do you remember using acetaminophen during pregnancy? And the primary outcomes they were looking at were autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability diagnosis over the subsequent years from 1985 to 2019. They also collected a ton of other information to say, is there some other confounding variable that is actually the root cause of the difference they're seeing here? This then talks about the statistical analysis that they used and then how they looked at siblings and everything along those lines. This table just looks at the patient demographics. So they really got into weeds of what part of Sweden do they live in? Is it their first pregnancy or multiple pregnancies? What was the pregnancy weight looking like? Smoking status, Swedish-born citizen, highest household education, and season of birth. They were really trying to look at all the different variables that could account for why there was a higher level or a lower level of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability. The other thing, I think this is on the slide here that I wanted to share, is those 2 million, they had a lot of children to work with when it comes to those that were exposed to acetaminophen. So they had over 185,000 children with exposure to acetaminophen during pregnancy to work with. And then this table just looks at childhood diagnoses, whether it's autism, ADHD, intellectual disability, and then diagnoses of the child or parent, and then drug use during pregnancy and healthcare visits and all those sorts of things. So it's trying to get a lot more information. The other nice thing is that they followed them over a long period of time. So here we're talking about overall, the average follow-up was 13 years, so that we could see if there was any diagnoses of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disabilities. Again, it was watching them over time to see what happened. Now, here's where things get interesting. Here they say, in the final adjusted model in the population-based table, children exposed to acetaminophen were more likely to be diagnosed with autism, ADHD, and intellectual disability. And if you stop reading there, you think, oh, it's associated with it. Now, when we look at those amounts, the confidence interval here, I like to think of this as like if you multiplied it by normal. So if it was 1, it would be the exact same. So it's slightly above. And if it was 2, it would be twice as likely. But this confidence interval says it's 1.02 to 1.08 times more likely, which translates into about a 5% increased risk. I like to think in percentages of increased risk. Now, that does not mean that 5% of children that were exposed to acetaminophen were autistic. That would be a huge number. In fact, it's just a 5% increased risk over the baseline, which obviously is a low risk anyways, but it's a 5% increased risk. So if you stop there, then you would say, I'm done reading this, that it's associated with it. They even said that right in the study.
Then what they did was they actually looked at the siblings of those kids, because we know that autism, ADHD, intellectual disability is not just one thing, and could it be that there are confounding variables? And what they found is when they controlled for siblings, that number disappeared. So if you look here, they controlled for siblings. Siblings share the same genetics and often the same environment and the same parents. And what that translated to is that when you controlled for siblings, that 1.02 to 1.08 actually disappeared and just became across 1, which means that there isn't an increased risk in siblings. Same thing for ADHD. Here, when we look at the population level, it's 1.07, which is above 1, but when we account for siblings, it's across the 1. That means that 4 to 1.0, 1.02 means that it's not an increased risk, that the confidence interval shows that it is the same risk as the general population. And so when they talk about it, they then get into the weeds of sibling control analysis found no evidence that acetaminophen during pregnancies was associated with increased risk. Once we've taken into account these children were exposed to acetaminophen, but they also had siblings, and we looked and compared those siblings and the outcomes, since they share the same genetics, since they share a similar environment, that there's no increased risk in those cases. Now, what the final conclusion is, then, if we read the whole study and we look at their analysis, is that acetaminophen used during pregnancy was not associated with children's risk of autism.
If you stuck with me this long, hopefully that was helpful and kind of to walk through the science and everything along those lines. It is very easy to cherry pick data to support our assumptions, or to place blame on people that don't deserve the blame placed on them, whether it's mothers, whether it's big pharma or anything like that. I don't like big pharma as much as you don't, but we need to actually understand autism so that we can help children and families to thrive, rather than just to live in this place of guilt and shame and blame and wondering. So hopefully this has been helpful. Please share it. If so, thanks.